What if one fleeting moment could consume everything I worked so hard to build? That night I didn't just slip up. I threw a match into a powder keg. When my stepson walked through that door, our secret uncoiled like a snake, ready to strike and shatter the life I'd so carefully created. The storm outside raged like a caged beast, its fury mirroring the turmoil inside me. I sat curled up on the couch, wrapping my blanket around me as if it could protect me from the emotional storm brewing within. The living room was dimly lit, shadows dancing with each flash of lightning. I felt exposed, raw, an unfamiliar sensation that both excited and scared me. It had been so long since I'd allowed myself to feel anything deeply. With Mark, everything was neat, orderly, safe. But tonight the safety felt like a cage, and I craved something wilder, something more intense. As thunder rumbled overhead, I closed my eyes, letting the energy of the storm in my hands envelop me. My mind wandered, tracing patterns in the darkness, patterns that led back to Mark, then onward to Dylan, to the way he'd been looking at me lately, with an almost hungry curiosity. A shiver ran down my spine, and I pushed the thought aside, attributing it to nothing more than the cold of the storm. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, bringing me back to reality. My heart pounded as I listened closely, hearing footsteps approaching. Mark couldn't be home yet, could he? Another creak, closer this time, and my breath caught in my throat. The door to the living room swung open, revealing a figure silhouetted against the faint light from the hallway. I squinted, trying to see who it was as they moved further into the room. Then they stepped into the dim light of the lamp, and I saw that it was Dylan. "Dylan," I breathed, clutching my chest. "You're home early." His eyes widened in surprise, and he darted from me to the blanket wrapped around me and back again. "Elaine," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't expect you to be here alone." I stood up abruptly, throwing the blanket down to cover my lower body. The air between us felt thick and heavy, filled with an undercurrent I'd never noticed before. Or maybe I had noticed and just ignored. Now it demanded recognition. Dylan's gaze traveled down my body, lingering on places he'd never looked at me before. My breath caught in my throat as his eyes finally met mine again, filled with a curiosity that sent a jolt through me. "Dylan," I started, but my voice faltered. What could I say? "I was just sitting here thinking about how you've been looking at me lately." "No, of course not." Instead I stammered, It's good to have you home." He nodded slowly, his eyes still locked onto mine. "Yeah," he agreed softly. "It is." The silence stretched between us, filled only by the rain hammering against the windows. I wanted to say something, anything to break this tension, but all I could do was stare at him, struck by how different he seemed tonight. It was a mistake, wasn't it? I whispered finally, more to myself than to him. Dylan's eyes flickered with something unreadable, and before I could process what it meant, he turned away. "I should go," he muttered, leaving me alone with my thoughts in the storm. As I watched his retreating form disappear into the darkness of the hallway, I couldn't help but wonder, what had just happened? And more importantly, where did we go from here? The days after that fateful night are etched into my memory like a brand. I moved through our house like a ghost, keeping to myself, always one room ahead of Dylan. I busied myself with chores, pretending not to notice him, yet every creak of the floorboards under his feet sent my heart racing. Dylan, on the other hand, seemed unfazed. He went about his life as if nothing had changed, except for these subtle shifts, helping me carry groceries in from the car, fixing the leaky faucet that had been driving me crazy. Each time he happened to be nearby, I felt my cheeks flush, my pulse quicken. One evening I was standing at the kitchen counter, chopping vegetables for dinner, when Dylan walked in. I froze, knife midair, as he leaned against the doorway, watching me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. "Are you okay, Elaine?" His voice was soft, hesitant. It wrapped around me like a caress, making my breath hitch. I'm fine," I stammered, turning back to my task. "Just preoccupied with dinner." "No, I mean, after the other night." He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving mine. "I feel bad about surprising you like that." My heart hammered in my chest as I forced myself to meet his eyes. There was no judgment there, only concern. It was disarming. "It's fine, Dylan," I insisted, more sharply than intended. It was an accident. He nodded slowly, but the curiosity in his gaze didn't fade. Instead, it seemed to deepen as if he could see right through me. Still, he pressed gently, I don't want things to be weird between us. They're not. I snapped, then softened my tone when I saw the hurt flash across his face. It's just complicated. Dylan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know it is. But we're family, aren't we? We should be able to talk about things. Family. The word hung heavy between us, laden with unspoken truths and forbidden desires. I swallowed hard, turning back to my task as tears threatened to well up in my eyes. Later that night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain patter against the windowpane, I found myself reliving those moments. The way his eyes had searched mine, seeking something more than just reassurance. The warmth of his hand brushing against mine as he helped unload the dishwasher. The softness of his voice when he asked if I was okay. Guilt gnawed at me like a ravenous beast, tearing apart any remnant of peace I might have had. How could I feel these things? These wrong, forbidden things for my stepson? It went against everything I believed in, everything I'd sworn to protect. And yet, there it was. A faint, dangerous warmth that lingered despite the guilt, defying logic and reason. It whispered through me like a secret, daring me to acknowledge it, to explore it further. I buried my face in my pillow, stifling a groan as tears finally spilled over. What had I done? What had we started? Days turned into a week, then two. Dylan's subtle advances continued, helping with tasks around the house, sharing meals, finding reasons to be near me. Each encounter left me more flustered than the last, my heart pounding in my chest as if trying to escape. One evening, as I sat on the back porch sipping a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Dylan joined me. He held up another glass, filled with deep red liquid that glinted in the fading light. Mind if I join you? His voice was soft, tentative. I shook my head, wordless as he settled into the chair beside mine. We sat in silence for a moment, sipping our wine, letting the cool evening air wrap around us like a blanket. Felt nice. Too nice. So, Dylan began after a while, how are you really doing, Elaine? I turned to look at him, surprised by the genuine concern in his eyes. What do you mean? I asked warily. He shrugged, swirling the wine in his glass. You just seem different lately. Distant. My throat tightened around a sudden lump. Different. Had he noticed my turmoil? Or was this just his way of probing for more information about our shared secret? I'm fine, I lied, looking away from him. Dylan sighed, setting his glass down on the small table between us. You don't have to pretend with me, you know. We're family. The word family hung heavy in the air, loaded with unspoken truths and forbidden desires. I took a deep breath, steeling myself against the emotions threatening to overwhelm me. Sometimes I feel like I'm trapped, I admitted softly, my voice barely audible over the chirping crickets. Like I'm living someone else's life. Dylan nodded slowly, understanding flickering across his features. I know what you mean. It's like, everyone expects something from me, but no one really knows me. He paused, then added quietly, not even you. His words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with my own sense of isolation. I turned to face him, our knees almost touching, and saw the truth reflected in his eyes. He felt it too, this chasm between us, this yearning to connect. Silence stretched between us, heavy and thick with unspoken words. My heart pounded in my chest as Dylan reached out, his fingers brushing against mine where they rested on the armrest. I should have pulled away, but I didn't. Instead, I let myself feel the warmth of his touch, the electric current that seemed to arc between us. His hand turned over, palm up, inviting me to hold it. I hesitated for a moment, then placed my hand in his, feeling his fingers curl around mine. Felt right somehow. Natural. But then reality crashed back in, and I jerked my hand away as if burned. I'm sorry, I stammered, standing up abruptly. I can't. We can't. Dylan looked up at me, confusion and hurt warring in his gaze. Elaine, wait. No. I cut him off, backing away towards the door. This was a mistake. We can't do this. With that, I fled inside, leaving Dylan alone on the porch with nothing but the fading light and the echoes of our forbidden conversation. As I stood staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, I whispered the question that haunted me. What am I doing? But deep down I already knew the answer. I was dancing on a razor's edge, teetering between right and wrong, love and lust, family and infidelity. And God help me, but I didn't want to stop. I woke up that night to the sound of my own ragged breathing, heart pounding like a drum in my chest. The house was dark, quiet save for the distant hum of the refrigerator cycling on downstairs. I tossed and turned for what felt like hours, but sleep eluded me. Eventually I gave up, throwing back the covers and padding down to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I descended the stairs, I noticed light spilling out from the living room. Had Mark forgotten to turn off the lamp again? But as I approached, I heard voices. Not just any voices, but Dylan's, low and intense. Curiosity piqued, I moved silently towards the doorway, peeking around the corner. There he was, sprawled out on the couch, eyes fixed on the TV screen. But something was different. His face was flushed, jaw tense as if he were barely containing some emotion. What had gotten into him? I stepped into the room, clearing my throat softly. Dylan? Can't sleep. He turned to look at me, surprise flickering across his features before it was replaced by something else. Hunger. Desire. Or maybe that was just my imagination running wild. Not really, he admitted, sitting up straighter as I moved closer. You either, huh? I shrugged, taking a seat on the opposite end of the couch from him. Just one of those nights. We fell into an uneasy silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The tension between us was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. I couldn't help but steal glances at him. The way his hair fell across his forehead, the curve of his lips as he watched the TV screen. You know, he started suddenly, turning to face me. I've been thinking. About what? My voice came out barely above a whisper. He hesitated for a moment before continuing. About us. About how you're always there for me, even when no one else is. His eyes searched mine, pleading with me to understand. It's like you see me, Elaine. The real me. My heart ached at the raw vulnerability in his voice, at the longing that mirrored my own. I wanted to reach out, to touch him, but I held back, fear and guilt warring within me. I wish things could be different, he whispered, moving closer on the couch until our knees were almost touching. I wish we could talk like this all the time. Dylan. I started, my voice trailing off as he leaned in closer still. His breath was warm on my lips, his gaze locked onto mine. Say something, Elaine, he urged softly. Tell me to stop, or tell me you feel it too. I opened my mouth, intent on saying something, anything to put an end to this madness. But no words came out. Instead, I found myself leaning in, closing the distance between us until our lips met in a soft, tentative kiss. It was over almost before it began, but it left me reeling nonetheless. My hand flew to my mouth as I stared at him, horrified at what I'd just done. Elaine. He started, reaching out for me, but I shrank back, shaking my head violently. No, I whispered, standing up abruptly. No, this can't happen again. And with that, I fled the room, leaving Dylan watching me with a mixture of determination and regret in his eyes. As I ascended the stairs, one thought echoed through my mind like a mantra. What have I done? And more importantly, could I still stop it from happening again? I could feel it. The tension in the house was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Each time I heard Dylan moving around downstairs, my heart leapt into my throat, guilt gnawing at me like a ravenous beast. How could I face him after what had happened? After what we'd done? So I avoided him, locked myself away in my room, buried myself under work, anything to keep from confronting the truth. But every moment spent hiding only served to drive the wedge between us deeper, turning the tension into something palpable, alive. Then one afternoon the doorbell rang. I froze, listening as Dylan answered it, his voice muffled but distinctly surprised. A feminine laugh echoed through the house, and my stomach churned with dread as I recognized it, Naomi, Dylan's ex-girlfriend. I hovered in the hallway, eavesdropping shamelessly as they greeted each other. Her voice was breathy, flirtatious even, as she explained her unexpected visit. Something about old-time sake, reconnecting. As they moved into the living room, I took my chance, slipping down the stairs and out of sight. But Naomi's eyes were like a hawk's, missing nothing. She spotted me immediately, her gaze narrowing as she took in my disheveled appearance. "Elaine," she greeted coolly, extending a hand towards me. "Long time no see." I hesitated before taking it, her grip firm and confident. Too confident. "Naomi," I acknowledged, forcing a smile. "It's been a while." She settled onto the couch beside Dylan, crossing her legs so that her skirt rode up slightly. His eyes flicked towards her, then away, but not before I caught the flicker of interest in them. "So what brings you by?" I asked, aiming for casual indifference. Naomi shrugged, turning to face Dylan with a conspiratorial smile. "Just thought it was time we caught up. After all, we have so much history together, don't we?" The insinuation hung heavy in the air, and I saw Dylan shift uncomfortably beside her. He glanced at me then, his expression guilty, pleading almost. Over the next hour, Naomi made herself at home, asking about Mark, prying into our lives with a sickening sweetness that made my skin crawl. All the while, she kept casting these knowing glances at Dylan, as if daring him to defy her. Finally, when I thought I couldn't take any more, she turned to me, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You know," she started, leaning in conspiratorially, "I've always wondered something about you and Dylan." My heart stopped dead in my chest, every muscle tensing as I braced myself for what was coming next. "What's that?" I asked, forcing the words out through gritted teeth. Naomi smirked, her gaze flicking between me and Dylan. "I wonder if there's something more going on here than meets the eye." She leaned back, crossing her arms over her chest as she watched us like a cat playing with its prey. "Don't you, Dylan?" His name was barely out of her mouth before he was shaking his head vehemently. "No," he insisted, too quickly, too sharply. "Of course not." But Naomi just laughed, a sound that grated against my already frayed nerves. "Oh, come on," she teased, reaching out to pat him on the knee. "You can't fool me, Dylan. I know you better than anyone." And with that, she stood up, gathering her things with an air of finality. As she reached the door, she turned back to us, her eyes glinting dangerously. "By the way," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wonder what Mark will think about all this?" The blood drained from my face as I stared at her, frozen in place as the implication of her words sank in. She knew. Or at least she suspected enough to cause trouble. As Naomi walked out the door, leaving Dylan and me alone with nothing but the weight of our shared secret hanging between us, one thought echoed through my mind like a funeral dirge. This was only just beginning. Mark was home early. Too early. His key turning in the lock sent a jolt of panic through me, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged animal desperate to escape. I'd been expecting it, dreading it since Naomi's cryptic warning, but still the reality of him being here now, under our roof, was almost too much to bear. "Elaine!" His voice echoed through the house, followed by the sound of his suitcase dropping onto the floor. "I'm home." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come as I stepped into the hallway. "Hey," I greeted him weakly, forcing a smile onto my lips. "You're back early." Mark looked up from where he was hanging his coat, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in my appearance. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Flight got moved up." He hesitated before adding, "Is everything okay here? You look tense." I shrugged, turning away to busy myself with anything to avoid his gaze. "Just a lot on my mind," I muttered. Over dinner that night, the tension was palpable. Mark kept shooting glances at Dylan, then at me, as if he could sense the undercurrent of unease that hummed between us like a live wire. And Naomi's parting words echoed in my head with every passing moment, gnawing at me until I thought I'd go mad. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mark pushed his plate away, his brow furrowed in thought. "So," he started, clearing his throat, "Naomi was here today." I froze, the blood draining from my face as I stared at him, wide-eyed and mute. Beside me, Dylan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Yeah, she just stopped by to say hi," he mumbled, avoiding Mark's gaze. Mark nodded slowly, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of suspicion that made my stomach churn with dread. "She seemed interested in you too," he said, his voice careful, measured. I felt the floor drop out from under me as I realized what he meant. Naomi had been here, planting seeds of doubt, whispering her poisonous suggestions into Mark's ear. And now he was looking at us with new eyes, seeing things that weren't there, or worse, things that were. Mark. I started, my voice barely above a whisper. It's not Dash. He held up a hand, silencing me mid-sentence. I don't want to talk about it now, he said firmly. Let's just forget about it. But as the days passed, it became clear that Mark hadn't forgotten anything. He was watching us, waiting, his eyes dark with suspicion whenever Dylan and I were in the same room together. It was torture, pure and simple, each stolen glance. Every whispered word felt like walking on eggshells, waiting for the moment when everything would shatter around us. Meanwhile, Naomi's silence was deafening. We waited for her to strike, bracing ourselves for the blow that would surely come. And then one day it did. A message pinged through on Dylan's phone. A demand for money, accompanied by a threat that sent ice water coursing through my veins. She knew everything. She'd seen us together, and now she wanted payment for her silence. Dylan looked at me, panic etched into every line of his face. We can't give in to her, he whispered, grabbing my hands in desperation. We have to think of something else. Together we devised a plan, one that would put an end to Naomi's threats once and for all. But as we sat there, our heads bent together over the table, whispering frantically about what needed to be done, we didn't hear Mark approach. And then, like a gunshot in the silence, his voice echoed through the room. What are you two planning? We spun around, guilt and shock written plainly on our faces. Behind him, scattered across the kitchen countertop, were the incriminating texts from Naomi, every damning word laid out for Mark to see. His eyes flicked between us, confusion turning slowly into understanding, then horror as he took in the full extent of our betrayal. Tell me the truth, he said finally, his voice shaking with anger and hurt. What's going on between you and Dylan? As I stared at him, my heart breaking into 1,000 tiny pieces. I knew that there was no turning back now. The cat was out of the bag, and our lives would never be the same again. The kitchen was too small for all of us. The air thick with tension, each breath heavy with the weight of our secrets. Mark stood by the counter, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white, eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and pain. Beside him, Naomi smirked, her arms crossed over her chest as if she was enjoying the spectacle. Dylan and I faced them side by side but worlds apart. His gaze flicked to me briefly before darting away again, guilt written plainly on his face. My heart ached for him, for us, for what we'd thrown away so recklessly. Well, Mark's voice sliced through the silence, cold and sharp as a blade. Someone better start explaining. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what was to come. It was my fault after all. I'd started this mess, and now it was up to me to clean it up. Mark, I began softly, but he cut me off with a sharp gesture. No, he said firmly. No more lies, Elaine. No more half-truths or excuses. Just tell me. What the hell is going on between you two? I glanced at Dylan, who nodded almost imperceptibly, giving me permission to speak for both of us. So I did. I told Mark about our moments together, stolen glances, whispered words, the kiss that had changed everything. I left nothing out, spilling my guts until there was nothing left but emptiness and shame. Through it all, Dylan stood silent and stoic beside me, his gaze fixed firmly on the floor. But when I reached the end of our story, when I admitted to Mark that we'd been intimate, that we'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, he looked up at last, meeting my eyes with a mix of sorrow and resignation. Mark listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. When I finally fell silent, he turned to Naomi, who still stood there watching us like a hawk. And you? He growled, advancing on her until she took a step back, her confidence wavering for the first time since she'd walked through our door. You've been playing puppeteer with our lives, manipulating us all for your own gain. Naomi's smirk faded, replaced by an expression of false innocence. I don't know what you're talking about, she protested weakly. Mark scoffed, grabbing his phone from the counter and thrusting it into her face, no doubt displaying the incriminating messages we'd found earlier. Don't play dumb with me, Naomi. We both know you've been blackmailing them. Her facade crumbled then, anger flaring in her eyes as she faced off against Mark. Fine, she snarled. Yes, I wanted money, but only because they deserved to pay for what they did. They ruined my life, Mark. Dylan broke my heart, and Elaine. She spat the word like a curse. She stole him from me. Mark looked at her then with something approaching pity. You're pathetic, he said quietly. And I want you out of our lives now. Naomi sneered, grabbing her bag from the table. Gladly, she retorted, storming towards the door. But as she reached it, she paused, turning back to me one last time. This isn't over, Elaine, she promised darkly. Not by a long shot. And with that she was gone, leaving us alone in our shattered world. In the silence that followed, Mark turned to Dylan, his expression unreadable. I need some time, he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. To process all of this. He looked at me then and I saw the hurt there deep and raw. We'll talk later. As Mark left the room, the weight of his absence settled over us like a shroud. Dylan and I stood there for a moment longer, our shoulders touching but our hearts miles apart. I'm so sorry, I whispered, turning to face him at last. I never meant for this to happen. He reached out, cupping my cheek gently in his palm. Neither did I, he murmured. But we can't change the past, Elaine. All we can do is face it head-on and hope that somehow, someway we'll find a way through. As his lips brushed against mine once more, I knew that this was our turning point. The moment when everything changed forever. And as I closed my eyes, losing myself in his kiss, I realized that no matter what happened next, there could be no going back.